Hello everyone, my name is Mengying Liu, and today the topic I want to talk about is gender issues in a disaster. And here is my photo. Speaking of gender relations in disasters, the most important concept that we have to figure out is that how women differs from men in a disaster. Women and men of varying ages groups have different life experience and skills owing to gendered identities, roles, and responsibilities. This is key to understand gender-based differences in disaster impact, response, and recovery. It is widely researched and documented that women belonging to different social classes, races, ethnic, and age groups are more vulnerable than other male counterparts of the same social class before, during, and after disasters. To fully demonstrate these questions, we can analyze from those two factors. The first is biological factor. The biological differences between men and women make significant variations in how they individually behave, relate, and respond in the disaster cycle. These differences also have implications in the social and institutional patterns of the response. The sexual differences are mainly related to the biological reproductive function. The social extension of reproductive function has implications for both men and women, but with significant differences for each sex. The second part that we have to consider is biological aspects in the emergency response. Displacement in the disaster aftermath represents different scenarios for women and men. Although both have been impacted and uprooted from home, the biological aspects demand certain specific needs of women that must be met, like pregnancy and lactation, as well as dealing with the social and cultural norms attached to menstruation and childbirth. As is listed below, the following are some of the gender-based factors which put girls and women at higher risk in disasters. Speaking of gender issues in a disaster, there are three main questions that we have to figure out. First, we have to understand the gender issues during a disaster and why is it important. The third question is why the gender issue should be considered into risk and disaster management process during emergency management. What is gender issue during a disaster? As we can see, the effects and impacts of disaster, the individual and institutional response differs for men and women. These differences arise from a combination of factors and their dynamic interrelationships. Some of the key factors include biological, sexual, and social-cultural factors, which are reflected in gender relations in communities and societies. As you can see, that is what caused the gender issues in a disaster. And the second question becomes, why is it important? The needs of women are generally overlooked in the relief and recovery processes, and their capabilities and skills are not used as a resource in emergency management and planning. This not only results in denial of benefits to women, but also worsens their social and economic status. And then comes the third question. Why the gender issue should be considered into risk and disaster management process during an emergency management. To answer this question, we have to consider these 5 parts. The first is that gender has been neglected in disaster research, planning, and practice, but a new paradigm is emerging. If addressed at all, gender has been integrated into disaster research and practice as a demographic variable or personality trait, and not as a basis for complex and dynamic sets of social relations. Gender is also seen as an aspect of women's lives more than men's and liberated of social class. For example, women are disaster victims because they are poor. Instead, shapes human responses to disaster, both directly and indirectly. Women are especially hard hit by the social impacts of environmental disasters. While natural disasters often impact human communities very broadly, residents are not equally at risk of loss and harm, nor equally able to recover. Poor households are well known to be especially vulnerable, but gender-specific effects are also suggested. The third is that gender inequality is a root cause of women's disaster vulnerability. Global forces and social changes placing more people at great risk of disaster also disproportionately impact women. Subordination is the root cause of disaster vulnerability. Women's economy insecurity, for example, high poverty rates, contingent labor homework, lack of credit, and saving increases their needs for post-disaster financial assistance. Ideological constraints on female mobility may limit access to life-saving information, shelter, or relief goods. Male dominance in disaster decision-making undermines women's great willingness to mitigate the effects of known hazards. For example, moving livestock tools or household goods to safer locations, making evacuation plans may misdirect disaster relief from family needs to personal interests, and often leads to gender-biased relief and reconstruction programs. The fourth part we have to consider is that women are not universally or identically impacted by disaster. Highly vulnerable women have specific needs and interests before, during, disaster. Gender relations into account suggests that those most likely to be hard hit and to need long-term assistance recovering from environmental disasters should be considered specially. Highly vulnerable girls and women may not be socially visible or included in disaster plans, but they have urgent needs. For example, the safe and accessible evacuation space and temporary housing, equitable access to food and clothing, and other relief good transportation assistance. The last part is that gender shapes capacity as well as vulnerability. Women are active and resourceful disaster responders, but often regarded as helpless. Women have a lot to do during a disaster. For example, women's reproductive disaster work includes mitigation the effects of hazard on land, livestock, tools, and other economic resources, provisioning households for crisis, preparing, cleanup, and repairing job sites and home-based work spaces, and so on and so forth. Actually, during a disaster, women can be a very helpful resource in disaster recovery, but people often ignore their capacity and regard them as helpless victims. We should divide the work and make them become our powerful resource during the disaster. And that's all about my presentation. Thanks for watching.